From the wombs of mortal women, seeded by beings not of this earth, were born the Nephilim, giants of impossible stature, might, and hunger. Not made in the image of man, nor molded by the hand of God,
They were something new.
a hybrid of terror, unfit for heaven, unworthy of earth. Their height was 3,000 ells, say the scrolls, and their gaze devoured the horizons. Their voices shook the valleys, their footfalls cracked the mountains. Born in wrath, they knew no rest. Born of arrogance, they bore the curse of excess. As they matured, they claimed dominion over the world of men, not as rulers, but as predators. They walked naked and adorned in bronze. They carved mountains into their thrones. With hands of stone, they broke cities as if they were clay. They enslaved men to build their citadels and feast halls. They crowned themselves gods, and some were worshipped as such. And they consumed all the acquisitions of men. The scrolls say, when men could no longer sustain them, they turned on mankind. No army could stand against them. Arrows shattered against their skin, spears were swallowed by the vastness of their chests. They herded humans like cattle, devoured livestock whole, drank rivers dry, and feasted on flesh. Their corruption went beyond hunger. The Nephilim sinned against nature itself. They hunted the sacred beasts, twisted the creatures of earth, and bred horrors in their lairs. They built altars not of praise, but of blood. They began to sin against birds and beasts, and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh. Yes, even among themselves the Nephilim turned. The strong devoured the weak, and the world became an arena of God's ruin, warring without purpose. The earth itself, wounded and soaked in innocent blood, groaned under the weight of the Nephilim. Mountains trembled, the seas fled their coasts,
And the skies darkened.
and the earth, a living thing in the old days, accused the Nephilim before the throne of heaven. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. The Nephilim had not only defied man or beast, they had violated the balance of creation. Their fall did not come by the hand of man. No mortal blow could slay them all. It was heaven itself that intervened. At the command of the Most High, the archangels descended. Gabriel stirred war among the Nephilim. Brother turned on brother. Cities of giants were swallowed by the earth. Then the flood came. Not a rain, but a deluge sent to purge the flesh of the giants from the face of the earth. They raged as they drowned. Their roars echoed across mountaintops, but not one was spared. Though their bodies perished, the Nephilim left footprints in stone and scars upon the earth. Their skeletons buried beneath forgotten ruins, their names whispered in half-remembered myths. Their story lives on in every tale of monstrous giants. Goliath, Og of Bashan, and the Titans of old, but none matched the terror of the forgotten firstborn giants.
The Nephilim, who ruled before the flood.
Alright, I was going to talk about the Nephilim in general. I was just going to, go over some of that, but okay, everything right there, that horrible introduction that I just did, that's all from the Book of Enoch. I wasn't going to originally focus on Enoch in this episode, but I guess that's what we're going to do now. So that way I can stay on course and I don't go all over the place, because I was originally going to talk about the concept of the Nephilim as we find it all over the planet. Because, what's interesting is that, as the Nephilim are described in the Book of Enoch, we also find these exact same style of stories and descriptions all over the planet, right? Independent of the Book of Enoch, right? And don't forget, by the way, the Book of Enoch is not a well-known story. It's not a well-known book of the Bible. It was discovered relatively recently. So if anybody's, trying to think, well, maybe the Spanish brought it over to South America, and that's how the South Americans knew about the Book of Enoch, and that's why they have the same story. No. No, they didn't have the Book of Enoch back during Spanish times. Okay, all right, so here, we're going to focus up. I really did originally want to cover kind of the broader scope, but I guess what we'll do now relative to the Nephilim is that I'll just pick a specific culture or a specific story, and we'll go through that story, pick out a lot of the details and analyze the details, and then see where it takes us. And that's good, because that way I can focus on a single thing and I don't go off on a tangent. We don't stop talking about things that don't matter or aren't relevant to the subject, and we don't have to worry about wasting our time. The Book of Enoch itself is incredibly fascinating as a story, because while we are going to focus solely on the Nephilim situation, the book itself covers all kinds of crazy concepts, and the main character, Enoch, has some pretty crazy adventures. Now, I'm not going to dive too much into any of that, because that's a whole separate show and study in and of itself, and we will actually do that later, because, now that I think about it, the Book of Enoch is one of those schizo topics that really I probably should have already covered to some degree or another, and I really haven't. So maybe we'll do that later. Maybe I'll actually do that next. Anyway, it doesn't matter. What I want to talk about today, though, specifically is the concept of the Nephilim. What are these characters or creatures or beings or whatever you want to call them in this book? Now, the reason why this is something important to cover and go over and look at and study and analyze and all that garbage is because, as I sort of started to say earlier, the concept of the Nephilim are not unique to the Book of Enoch itself. And I think this is an extremely important point that needs to be made when we start to look at real history. So if you're of the atheist mindset and you completely hate the Bible, I understand that. And don't forget, I don't believe in God. I'm not over here preaching young earth creation or the Bible or anything like that. However, the Bible is still a historical document, whether we like it or not. That's just a scientific fact. It doesn't matter if every single word in the Bible is fiction. It doesn't matter if it's all fictitious. It's irrelevant. The point is that this work, whether it's fiction, half-truth, whatever, was still written centuries ago. Now, of course, if you believe in the Bible and you believe in God, you will place the Bible, upwards of 2,000 plus years ago with respect to when some of this stuff was written. Now, if we employ real chronology, the Bible's time frame comes much closer to us today. So, and I'm not going to get into this, but I do kind of want to set the stage for how interesting this whole topic gets. One of the things that Fomenko and his team figured out, and I tend to agree with them at this moment, they have a lot of evidence to support this, and it's scientific, it's all historical and scientific. They actually went out of their way to prove that the Bible, in the sense that we see it now, was completely created from scratch in the 1300s, maybe starting in the 1200s. And what I mean by that is, I don't mean compiled. I don't mean that people grabbed a bunch of biblical stories and just put them together and created the Bible, like a Council of Nicaea situation. No. That's not what I mean. What I mean is literally there were some people that sat down with blank pages and they just started grabbing at all kinds of random stories throughout history and compiled them into what they would call the Holy Bible, right? Or the King James Version, or the Septuagint. I guess it would be the Septuagint, would probably be more of the accurate originator there. Anyway, so things get a little weird when you think of it like that, because now the Bible is no longer an Abrahamic tradition. It did not start getting written, 2,000 plus years ago. Instead, what it is that it is a compilation of mythologies or histories, to be more accurate, from all kinds of cultures from within a wide area around the European area, compiled and then changed up into what would be called the Bible, or the story of Jesus, or the story of Moses, or whatever you want to say, right? Basically what happened is that the people who wrote the Bible took histories from all over the area that they could find, and these histories probably happened to one degree or another. These histories were legitimate events. And what they did is they stole all of those, compiled them into the Bible, and then, changed them up to fit into their narrative. This explains why the Bible is so weird and disjointed. Right? That this is one of the bits of ammo that atheists have against biblical scholars, is that, like it or not, biblical scholars, the Bible really is weird. I mean, it's a weird set of stories, and they don't really flow at all. It's very weird. But if you look at it through real history, and you look at it for what it truly actually is, a modern creation, relatively speaking, suddenly all of that makes sense. So when we look at something like the Book of Enoch, you thought I was forgetting it. Okay, I'm focusing up. Enoch. So when you look at Enoch, suddenly Enoch becomes kind of a very interesting and unique situation, because Enoch is not a biblical story in the sense of the Bible anymore. The Book of Enoch now becomes a story that was written by a completely different culture somewhere, and has now been ascribed to a biblical narration simply because, some guy said so. There's no real reason to believe Enoch is part of the Bible in the sense that people would believe, right? There's a reason why it didn't exist in the book originally. Right? There's a whole weird fuzziness with the Book of Enoch and its origins and where it came from. And to make matters worse, when we factor in real chronology and we get rid of stuff like the Dark Ages, we get rid of, 3 Roman empires, we get rid of ancient Greece, things for the Bible completely change. Right? The origins of these stories now, it comes into question completely. Right? So the Book of Enoch is interesting if for that reason alone, not just because of the stories that it contains in itself. That gets crazy, and we're going to talk about the Nephilim, but the entire book is insane. If for no other reason that it corroborates other stories all around the planet, and why should we find a story like Enoch being corroborated around the world? It's just weird. It's an oddity, and it's ignored by historians, and religious people just kind of say, well, God did it, so, of course everybody knows. So it gets into this, anyway, okay, let's focus on the Nephilim. Let's do this. So what are the Nephilim? What are we talking about? So I'm going to talk about the Nephilim in the sense of Enoch, so I'm going to give you guys, we're going to go over that concept. All right, so in the Bible, there's a few ways to look at the Nephilim. And interestingly enough, all of the ways that we're going to talk about here will be relevant to other cultures all over the planet. Because this is going to take 20 shows to go through, so we'll start here. But don't forget, everything I'm about to say here, this is not unique to the Bible. This is not unique to, Judaism, Christianity, whatever. It's not unique to those religions. All right. So the main and most well-known version of the Nephilim, or understanding of the Nephilim, would be under the fallen angel category. So here, people, basically Nephilim are described as their hybrid offspring of the sons of God. Or they're also known as the B'nai Elohim. And of course, they go and they find hot human women, and because they just can't resist it, they're called the daughters of men, and they go and they start to reproduce with them. Yeah, see, even back in the day, women were like, oh God, it sucks, man. Ugh. See, look at that. Human women are so hot, they even tempt, demons and gods. Just basic human women. I mean, okay, all right. Okay. Now, the sons of God, quote unquote, they are also commonly known as the Watchers. So basically, the main part of the story goes, the Watchers, they come down to Earth, they find hot human women, and they can't resist. And, one thing leads to another. And then when the women get pregnant and eventually give birth, can you have birth? When the women give birth, they will be giving birth to some kind of a genetic, I don't want to say monstrosity. Let's not say that yet. They will give birth to a new kind of living being. Let's say that. And as these new kinds of hybrid beings start to grow, they are eventually seen as giants. Because for some weird reason, when the Watchers mate with human women, I don't know, for some weird reason, apparently giants spawn. Don't ask me why, right? But it's interesting to note, this angle is very interesting because this says a few things about the Nephilim. The first thing it really points out is that the Nephilim themselves are very much flesh and blood. Now, I know there are stories around them that can make them sound maybe more powerful than they are, and we'll cover some of that later. But basically, you have a situation to where you have two different, apparently organic beings, hot human women and the Watchers, whatever the hell they were. I mean, they were obviously genetically compatible, so they were probably humanoid, to some degree. They are able to mate and create some kind of a new weird offspring. I find this aspect of the story fascinating for the same reason that a lot of people do. And maybe people will take it too far. But, the reality is this is a very grounded story. Right? You have two biologically compatible species or whatever, races or whatever the hell they were, who are able to come together and mate. This is all very basic biological science. You don't need to believe in a god to believe in this. You don't have to believe in the supernatural to understand that something like this is a possibility. Is it possible that in our past there was more going on and there were more, other kinds of humanoids walking around the planet and this took place? There's nothing unscientific about this. It's just very interesting. Now, there is a little bit of confusion when it comes to studying the Book of Enoch, and you might run into this, is that sometimes you will find that the Watchers themselves will be interpreted as the Nephilim. Now, I don't really have an opinion on this other than, I don't think so. I'm not on the side of the people that believe that Nephilim are the Watchers. As far as I can tell, those are two separate situations. But it's an interesting point to make, if for no other reason than to really highlight the fact that there's still some gray areas here. Oh, and by the way, whenever we read some kind of an ancient script, so I speak English, right? We're all listening in English right now. These texts were not written in English. They were written in other languages. So we have the unfortunate side of things to where we are dealing with a translation. And in some cases, it's a translation of a translation. And it can get even worse to where it can be a translation of a translation of a translation. So when you start to get into that area, things can become gray. So I in my opinion, that's probably where people are accidentally, well, I say accidentally, where people can maybe make a good argument that the Nephilim are the Watchers and not the offspring. They are not the giants. But I don't really follow that. So that's not really my, I don't know. I just wanted to throw that out there to be fair. Now, of course, since we care about chronology, one of the major questions that we need to ask, and I probably should have started maybe with this, is when the hell does this happen? Not just, what are the Nephilim and stuff like that, but when is all of this taking place? When were the Nephilim conceived? Understanding this is also going to be important when we talk about other cultures in the future having this story as well. So, if we look at chronology, we find that the Nephilim are pre-flood. They are an antediluvian species. This is extra important because this may give us a key into the science of the Nephilim being a real possibility. What am I talking about? The fact that the Bible actually places the existence of the Nephilim, who are supposedly giants, in a pre-flood environment gives us a scientific validation for their existence. Let me break this down. So nowadays, one of the amazing things that has been discovered is Saturn theory. And I'm not going to belabor the point. We've talked about that. There are tons of other videos that I've done and other people have done even better that go over the basic concepts, or at least the in-depth concepts. We'll talk about the basic ones here to set the stage. Why does this matter? All right, so prior to the deluge, as far as we can tell, Earth was in a completely different state of existence. And by that I mean completely different. We orbited Saturn, and Saturn was a red dwarf star, or a brown dwarf star, more than likely a brown dwarf star. This means that our entire existence was completely different from what it is today. And by existence, I mean everything from the way our planet looks geographically, to the way our atmosphere is, and to the gravity that we currently have on our planet. It appears that when we were orbiting Saturn, our gravity would have been different. And by different, it seems that our gravity would have been lighter. It would not have been as intense. Our electrical environment would have also been much different than today. One of the things that people need to remember with respect to biology is that we are all electrical beings. We do not exist without electricity. Like, biology is 100% dependent on electricity. And we now know that there is something called a Birkeland current that essentially powers Earth, and it flows through every single one of us. You can literally think of your head as a negative charge and your feet as a positive. I think it's that. It's one of the two polarities, right? There's a 50-50 chance I'm right. Anyways, but that's a fact. There is literally current going through your head, running down through your feet into Earth right now. A literal electrical current. This electrical current, or this electricity that we get from a Birkeland current, is one of the things that controls the gravity on our planet. If our electrical environment was different during the Saturnian configuration, what that means is that our gravity would have been different as well. And what that then means is that suddenly larger creatures, such as giants, such as Nephilim, now suddenly become a real biological possibility. One of the things that people don't really think about, especially in the mainstream nowadays, is the problem of biological size on the Earth. So right now, there's a reason why we do not have dinosaurs running around, right? You know, the concept of an ultrasaur or a T-Rex or whatever huge dinosaur you love. There's a problem with those biological entities, if they even existed. And I'm not gonna get into that. I don't really have an opinion on dinosaurs. That gets really weird. But if you're going to make a claim that a dinosaur was able to walk around the Earth, you cannot have Earth's modern gravity. It doesn't work. It just biologically does not work. You cannot have a biological system pumping blood through that large of a creature due to Earth's gravity. It just doesn't work. It's the inverse square law. It's a very simple physics situation. Everybody knows about this in physics, but nobody talks about it, especially when it comes to dinosaurs. And I always find this crazy because people have no problem, with dinosaurs running around at the huge sizes that science tells us they were, but then nobody deals with the biological problem. How do you get those size of creatures running around Earth if the gravity is identical to today's gravity? Because remember, paleontologists and geologists and all the mainstream scientists out there, they do not talk about Earth's gravity shifting whatsoever. Because they do not talk about it, what it means is that all of these bones from all of these animals that they are finding are technically impossible. Because these animals would never have been able to exist on Earth in our current gravity. This is a major issue. Now, one of the things that is interesting in the mainstream now is that we find scientists trying to say, things like, well, maybe the brontosaur was always in, water or something like that. And the reason why they have to say that is because more and more people are starting to look at the biological problem of giant biological creatures. Because you cannot have that large of a creature on Earth supporting its own weight with that kind of a blood flow going through its body under our current gravity. It just doesn't work. It's a scientific fact. There is no way around this. It's an impossibility. So what that tells us automatically, whether you're alternative or mainstream, you have no choice but to admit that Earth's gravity was different, at the very least, millions and millions of years ago, if you believe in modern chronology and uniformitarianism and all that trash. You have to admit that gravity had to have been different. And that is something that the mainstream refuses to admit. That is something that the mainstream does not want to touch. And the reason they don't want to touch it is because they have already built up this huge scientific foundation around, Earth basically not really changing for hundreds of millions of years. And certainly not the gravity. Because if they admit that gravity can change, that opens the floodgates to all kinds of possibilities. Now, it gets even crazier when we look at real science. When we look at the real science behind the biological creatures on the planet that existed even in the mainstream, just a few thousand years ago, we run into all kinds of very, very interesting problems and potential solutions. Now, let me focus in on the Nephilim. The story of the Nephilim does not take place millions and billions of years ago. The story of the Nephilim takes place only thousands of years ago. And of course, if we look around the planet and we look at other ancient mythologies that deal with this exact same situation, giants being born from, godlike entities or whatever the story might say. But the point, stands that biological women will give birth to these Nephilim. We find that everybody essentially has the exact same chronological order. These giants exist in a pre-flood environment. So if we follow the science and just basic logic, what that has to mean is that Earth should have then had a different gravity. There should have been a different environment because unless we're going to invoke godlike powers and magic, there's no way large giants who are 12, 15, 20 feet tall, I don't know how tall they truly got, maybe 12, 15 feet might be a legitimate situation. And that's probably where it was. But, we all hear the bigger stories and stuff like that. But without hard evidence, it's hard to say. Anyways, the point is, let's just say a 15-foot tall person. Let's just have fun. Let's say the 15-foot taller is the average giant. There's a reason why we don't have 15 feet tall people today. I don't care what kind of, weird pituitary gland problem you have, you're not getting to 15 feet tall. And if you did, you are going to have a very, very, very rough time on this planet as a human. because the human body, with the current gravity, would never be able to have full biological functionality given the human circulatory system. You simply will not be able to pump that much blood throughout the body to keep the body oxygenated. It just isn't going to happen. That's why nobody gets that tall. Right? Gravity literally stops us from biologically growing. You just can't do it. And by the way, this actually opens up the doors, or many doors, with respect to genetics and DNA, to what are the true capabilities of DNA. Now that's a whole other show in entirety, but it gets crazy like that, right? It is DNA, which in my opinion is an engineered molecule. Right? There's no way in hell that DNA just evolved. That's utterly scientifically ridiculous. But it really does open the door to wondering, how powerful is the DNA molecule? Right? Can the DNA molecule adapt to its environment? Is it that adaptable? I don't know. Anyway, like I said, different subject. Main point being is that if all of these stories of the Nephilim are real all around the world, then we are going to have a different gravitational situation on this planet. There's no choice. Because I'm not going to accept that God just, made magical creatures or whatever. I'm not going to do that because, I don't think anybody even claims that even in the old books. Yeah, does anybody claim that the Nephilim had godlike powers? Yeah, there's probably something in there, but I don't think anybody ever says that, yes, the Nephilim were able to walk around at their size because of magic, or because of the grace of the gods, or whatever. I don't think anybody makes that claim. So what that means is that the Nephilim, they're biological entities that have to survive by the same rules as everybody else. That's what that means. So Earth would have had to have been different. Now, what does that mean for your average human? I don't know. I'd be willing to bet that if we were to go back pre-deluge, right, pre-Saturn flare-up, I would be willing to bet that humans look different than we look now. I would not be surprised. In fact, I would guarantee it. I would actually guarantee it, considering the amount of time that has passed with respect to, genetic mishmashing in the world over the thousands of years that has happened. I guarantee that if we were to see our true ancestors like 10,000 years ago or whatever, we wouldn't even recognize them. Everybody would be like, who the hell are you? Right? You'd just be like, what are these guys? Right? They probably would look almost alien to us. Or they might look like literal gods, right? They might be in a much more genetic pure form. I don't know. Anyway, it would be very interesting to see that, though. So the problem of the Nephilim biologically has to be solved. We need a solution for that if we are going to believe any of these stories are real. If we look at Saturn theory, and we look at the science of Birkeland currents, and we look at electricity, and we look at plasma, and we look at what can happen to a planet in a different electrical environment, what that means is that we now have an explanation for how Earth could have had a different gravity. For those of you who are not convinced, let me say it in a different way. So I use dinosaurs as an example, but they're billions of years ago, or whatever the hell mainstream says. So people have a disassociation with that. But let's look at us like megafauna and megaflora. Right? Even if you believe in the mainstream chronology and you believe in mainstream science, right? You believe in an ice age, you believe the dark ages, all that crap, right? You believe in all that stuff. You still have a problem with megaflora and megafauna. How did all of those animals go extinct? How did we lose those ecosystems? Like, where the hell did they go? I mean, we have none of that on Earth today. Like, none of it. None of it survived. It's all gone. There are animals that used to walk on our planet only a few thousand years ago that were just monstrous. Even in the mainstream perspective. I mean, these things are huge, massive, and they're gone. I mean, they're gone. Woolly mammoths, they were huge. I mean, those creatures were just enormous, and there were millions of them. Right? You have like every single kind of species that has this ungodly huge version of itself. right? They found a turtle shell. A fossilized turtle shell that was what, like 20 feet across? 20-foot turtle shell. Now you can maybe argue that that thing lived in the water, fine, but still, that's crazy. You still have to have the biology to pump the blood. You know, it's still a problem, and we have no reason to believe that particular turtle had some kind of a weird biology to handle modern gravity. Right? There's probably a reason why that turtle is no longer allowed to exist. There's probably a reason why woolly mammoths are now gone, and we basically know why now. But you have to have a different gravity. I'd be willing to bet a lot that the only reason why the megaflora, why the megafauna was ever allowed to exist at all was because Earth's gravity was different relatively recently. Right? Earth's gravity was able to allow the megaflora and megafauna to survive until it changed. Now, the woolly mammoth situation, they are not taken out by the deluge. The woolly mammoth situation and the megaflora and megafauna that I am talking about right now, they come later. They come after the deluge. How they get there, how that whole situation works, I don't know. That's a whole other topic. But my point is that just generally speaking, to get these larger creatures on Earth, you are going to need a different Earth. And of course, that is exactly what all the histories say was going on. Right? And when we look at all of these stories from all over the world, everybody says that Earth was in a completely different configuration. This is a unanimous historical fact. There's no way around this. And mainstream historians ignore this. But if we take it at face value, if we say, yeah, there was a golden age, yeah, things were different, does that mean that it's possible that gravity was also different? If gravity was also different, then that means something like the Nephilim could have existed. Now the Nephilim that we find in the Book of Enoch become way more scientifically believable. And there's no way around it. Here's what's interesting about the Nephilim, is that if we apply real science, like I just kind of went over a little bit, and we look at the real history, and we corroborate that history with all other cultures all over the world, we come to the conclusion that Earth was different. And of course, if we start looking at geology and biology and all this other garbage, you have no choice but to come to the conclusion that Earth was in a completely different state than we find it today. All right. And of course, the flood will be the beginning of changing all of that. And of course, the flood is kicked off by, Saturn flaring up and kicking us out of its plasma sheath and all of that stuff. Okay. All right, so let's kind of get back to the biblical Nephilim. I know I went off on a tangent, but we've got to look at the Nephilim as real things. I think what I really want to do ultimately, and now I don't know even where I'm going with the show at all. I'm trying to stay focused, but the point is that if we're going to take the Nephilim seriously, let's try to put it in a real context. You can't just say the Nephilim were real and then not give us the science behind it, and that is what most people do. Most people will just believe that it's real, either for religious reasons or for or alternative historical reasons, but they won't know how to qualify their claim. So what I just did back there is I began to qualify the claim scientifically that I keep calling them creatures. Maybe they are creatures because they get pretty messed up later on. Anyway, these beings, here, I'll be nice. I'll be polite to the Nephilim. So if there's one still out there, remember that before you drink my blood. If we're going to say that they're real, they're going to have to survive in a real world environment. We cannot rely on an excuse like, oh, well, it's just, magic or godlike powers or, whatever. We can't do that. What we want to do is we want to take the things that our ancestors claim happened seriously, but that means we are going to have to find the science behind it. So what I just kind of covered a little bit, and we'll talk about it maybe in a different show, kind of goes over the real scientific possibility that these stories are based in fact, that these events actually took place. Now, the Nephilim in the Bible are giants. And unfortunately, these giants are generally not good people. For whatever reason, the Nephilim seem to have a disposition for running around and conquering and killing and eating humans. I find this fascinating because it seems that the vast majority of these giants have an immediate need to do that. So I wonder, from a genetic sense, was that some kind of weird genetic programming, some kind of weird hybrid situation that pops out of whatever the hell a Watcher was? And it really begs the question then, what kind of genetics does a Watcher have, right? To where for some weird reason, man, the giants just have to treat humans like cattle. And that's exactly what they did, apparently. So giants are born, they come out, they start, eating, killing, conquering, doing all of this stuff. And they start doing it on a large scale. It sounds like, they quite literally do this on, maybe a global scale. I was going to say maybe not a global scale, but yeah, this sounds like a global scale. Whatever was going on in the earth pre-flood, it must have been insane. You had you had these giants just dominating empires, full of humans that they were treating like cattle, and they were fighting each other. Huge wars, right? With giants and humans stomping around. It would be insane to see this. But that's what was going on. And once again, cultures all over this planet, they recall this same problem. Right? This was a problem. You essentially have a point to where these giants are literally using humans as cattle. And by that I mean the giants are just eating humans like we eat cows today. Right? They go out of their way to drink the blood of humans. This is a fascinating biological aspect of the story. A lot of people will say that this aspect of the story just exists because it's scary or it's just there for effect. And the concept is a simple enough one, right? Being eaten or consumed by another being sucks, right? That would suck, and that's scary, and that makes for a decent story. But is that all it is? Is it just a story? There's nothing unscientific about cannibalism. There's nothing crazy about it. Nobody's claiming that giants were shooting magical powers out of their hands, levitating people up in the air, ripping them in half, fireworks spouting from them. There's nothing crazy about anything that these Nephilim do. The craziest stuff that the Nephilim will be attributed to will be their great strength, and of course their wicked nature, both of which are not really fictional concepts. There's nothing amazing about great strength. You would expect some dude who was 15 feet tall back in the day without microplastics running through his blood and, estrogen everywhere. He's going to be huge and buff, dude. He's going to be gigantic. This dude is going to be ripped. These giants are going to be no joke. And same with the humans, by the way. The humans are all going to be, bodybuilders and stuff, slamming. It's just crazy back in the day, dude. Everybody's just wearing, loincloths, stomping around like Arnold, big-ass swords, and you got giants behind them. Can you imagine the wars? That would be insane. Okay, anyway. There's nothing weird about any of the claims of the things that the giants do. In the Book of Enoch, or just generally in the Bible, giants will be attributed to very basic achievements. They'll be conquerors, they'll be rulers, they will be great strong men, they will be evil. There is nothing unscientific about any of that. That is all very basic biological possibilities. So when we start to look at the Nephilim in this light, suddenly they become more of a realistic prospect. They may have actually existed, and the stories that are contained in Enoch and others may actually be recording real histories. Now, where things get really jacked up is, of course, we have the alternative side that has to run in here, and they start injecting aliens, and they start going crazy with things, and they create their own unrealistic mythos around the Book of Enoch. So what has happened over time is that the mainstream doesn't believe any of it simply because it just sounds like, God garbled up garbage from the Bible, religious garbage. And the other side of people now, and the alternative, they're over here talking about aliens and mad, sci-fi powers and all this other crazy stuff. we've created a situation, not we, I haven't done it, a situation to where something like the Book of Enoch cannot be read in a realistic fashion now because it's been made a mockery of both sides of the argument. Everything I've said so far, though, grounds it. I'm not looking at the giants as anything other than flesh and blood biological creatures. We don't need magic, we don't need sci-fi, we don't need anything. Right? We have two different kinds of humans coming together and making another kind of a human. That sounds like literally all that happened. And then if we have a completely different environment to which this was happening in, we have a scientifically valid area that could allow for the existence of the Nephilim. Now, if we look at another aspect of the story, and I kind of mentioned it at the very beginning of the show, we find a situation to where the giants are being attributed to doing things that are beyond, a biological entity's ability. By that I mean we have a situation to where the skies darken. We have a situation to where giants are destroying mountains. They are doing things that are beyond the scope of a biological entity. Even a biological entity that is a buff, 15-foot tall dude stomping around. That kind of a biological entity is not going to go and pick up a huge mountain and throw it across the sky. That kind of a dude is not going to magically darken the sky, right? There are events that are attributed to the giants which are, way outside of anybody's normal capability. In my opinion, what's happening here is two things. The first thing is just basic, creative license. They're just describing the strength of these guys. Right? They're carving a throne out of a mountain. Maybe that dude literally went to a giant rock that was in a mountain and carved a throne. I don't know. It does sound like the giants, the Nephilim, may have had some pretty good skill. It does sound like they would have been operating maybe on a higher level than we're giving them credit for when I talk about, them doing things like corrupting and just eating people. They may have been operating on a fairly intellectual level as well. The Nephilim situation gets weird because whatever they were, they were not us. They were not just a larger human. They were a completely different animal. So who knows what was going on in their head? Who knows what their capabilities truly were? I mean, the stories go so far as to make it sound like they may have actually been doing some kind of genetic engineering, right? They start twisting the creatures of the earth. They start breeding unnatural creatures. Now, what does that truly mean? I don't know. Maybe they were just literally breeding weird creatures. Somehow back, pre-flood time, you could do weirder things with biology. I don't know. I don't know if that means they had a whole lab set up and you had 15-foot tall muscular giants stomping around in lab coats, with beakers and stuff and microscopes, sitting there messing with the genome. I don't know. It's possible, I guess. I doubt it, but I don't know. I mean, who knows what was going on back then? But the fact that they talk about this at all shows us that Nephilim back in the day, pre-flood, they had a head on them. They were not stupid. I mean, they conquered humans. Not that would be hard or anything, but, they had no problem doing it. And they got it to where humans essentially worshipped them as gods, right? So they had a whole setup. They knew what they were doing. Anyway, when we look at these stories, we find them, being described as doing these, inhuman events, cosmological events almost, if you will. I would argue that most of those, or I would say that a lot of those, are simply, it's simply creative license. And I don't think anybody doubts that, right? However, there's more to it in my opinion, because it gets crazier. Because I think what has happened is that the translators and maybe the people who, eventually would write this story down, they may have lost some of what actually happened. I think that some of these events have been misinterpreted by the translators. I think that some of the events that begin to take place during these stories had nothing to do with the skill of the Nephilim themselves, but instead the history was describing the beginning of the cosmological catastrophic event that would lead to the deluge. Now, eventually, all of this fighting, all of this cannibalism, all of these horrible deeds that the Nephilim will usher in will eventually become too much for God, or the gods in cases of other cultures. And of course, this is what will eventually trigger the deluge. The gods will decide that the Nephilim are now too dangerous. They have ruined creation. They have destroyed everything. Everything on earth is now just evil. Humans have been corrupted beyond repair. There's suffering, death, war, disease. It's crazy. We have to wipe the slate clean. This is why the deluge will be triggered. The triggering of the deluge is something that I'm starting to find more and more fascinating as I do my research. Because if the Nephilim, for example, were just a creation of God and they were some kind of ethereal spirit or demon or whatever, right? You just have some kind of weird religious mumbo-jumbo magic fueling everything. It really does beg the question why God would go out of his way to drown the planet, to get rid of the Nephilim. Wouldn't it make more sense to just snap your fingers and get rid of them? I mean, do you really need to sit there and drown everybody? It doesn't really make sense in the context of a godly figure. Now, I realize that biblical scholars can jump on me, you can argue with me and all of that, but I don't know. I'm sorry, man. When you look at this situation, it seems like it would just be easier to say, you know what? If I was God, you say, I screwed up. All right, snap my fingers. Let's reset it. Let's give it another try, you guys. Come on. Obviously, I messed up when I made these cannibalistic, intelligent, genetic engineering giants that stomped around slapping people all day. That was probably a bad move. My bad. We're going to move on. But he doesn't do that. He decides he's got to drown them. He's got to get rid of them. The way God, she, whatever, you know what I mean. Don't be, okay. The way God decides to get rid of the Nephilim is fascinating because he has a global problem. You have all of these giants running around conquering and killing, and apparently God can't snap his fingers, so what does he do? He decides he needs a mass extermination situation to go down. A really good way to do mass extermination would be to do a mass drowning. I agree. That's a good way to do it. If you could cover the entire planet with water, yeah, you would get rid of a lot of people. I think we can all agree on that. But what this shows us is that God takes a very practical approach to exterminating biological life. He looks at his problem, and for some weird reason, he has no way of getting rid of all of these giants. It's just outside of his capability, apparently. But he needs to get rid of them. It's got to happen. And it's a global problem. Drowning the world would absolutely exterminate biological humanoid life, as biological humanoid life cannot breathe underwater. It's a very practical approach. And this is the approach that God chooses. So the giants are essentially brought to the throne of heaven to be judged. Now, the concept of a throne to heaven is universal. And what we now believe that the quote-unquote throne of heaven is a plasma formation that was connecting Earth to Saturn, and potentially other planets as well. If you lived in the pre-flood era, your night sky, or your day sky, or I should say your general quasi-constant afternoon sky, would be completely different than it is today. When they describe a throne of heaven, they are talking about some kind of mega plasma formation that everybody would be able to see. Once again, we have very simple science. Everything here is a reality and a possibility. Once again, this is all science. We don't need religion, crazy gods, or anything else. We don't need dark matter or dark energy or black holes either. We don't need relativity. We just need real science, plasma physics. Once we incorporate this, the story starts to become even more real. Because here we go. We have the throne of heaven now is in the story. What's the next thing that God does? He sends down the archangels. He sends down Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel. If you have been watching this channel at all, or are familiar with Velikovsky or any kind of a plasma physics Saturnian situation, we now know that archangels are planets. Archangels are not dudes with wings that fly around poking people with spears. No, they are planets. Venus, Mars, Uranus, etc. In this case, we would have, I believe, Venus, Mars, Mercury, and probably another planet that we don't know about today that might have been destroyed by now or has been kicked out of the solar system, or it's just called something completely different. And anyway, could be Titan for all I know. I don't know. So God sends down archangels. Well, who is God, by the way, in this? God is Saturn. I guess I should have said that earlier. God is Saturn. God is the creator. God is that big, giant, brown dwarf star orb that everybody would have been able to see while we were orbiting Saturn. They claim that God, Saturn, sends down other planets, his archangels. This is what will trigger the flood. Now, this is from a human perspective. Remember that. This is from somebody on Earth watching the sky. What's actually happening is this. Saturn, in its brown dwarf state, has an electromagnetic field around it. This electromagnetic field has now made contact with what we will eventually call our sun's electromagnetic field. Once these two fields touch, all hell breaks loose. When they say that God sends down the archangels, what is happening in reality is that all of the planets that are orbiting Saturn are now breaking apart. Their orbits are disintegrating because the entire electrical environment is being destroyed. It's changing. And all of the planetary bodies have to acclimate. From Earth, if you're looking up and you're watching these planets, you're going to see these planets come closer to Earth. They're going to bounce away from Earth. They're going to move erratically. This would be God, quote unquote, sending his angels. What happens shortly after this? The deluge. Saturn will flare up and release tons of water. Earth will then be rained on for a certain period of time, and of course the entire planet will be drowned. Now when we look at the Nephilim situation, when we look at this history and we use real science, real biology, plasma physics, real astronomy, we find that everything is possible. Did this actually happen to some degree in the past? I mean, is this what happened? Like, what was going on planet Earth, just 6, 7, 10,000 years ago? Because remember, this event is not millions and billions of years old. This is only thousands. 6, 7, 12, maybe 15. I don't know. But it's not hundreds of thousands and it's not millions or billions. This is all relatively recent, and all of science has proven this. This is not really, it's up for debate about, the date, because we don't have the exact date. But, the science is what it is. I don't know what to tell people. Mainstream ignores their conclusions. There's nothing I can do about that. So anyway, when we look at the Bible and we look at the Nephilim in the Book of Enoch, and I know Enoch's not in the Bible. Yeah, I know, you get it. When we look at the biblical story of Enoch, and we look at it through the context that we just went through here, suddenly the entire story with respect to the Nephilim becomes a scientific possibility. One of the other aspects that we find that may have been misinterpreted by the translators and by the record keepers, whoever eventually would write these stories down, is they gave credit for things like mountains breaking apart and, waters receding from shorelines and the skies darkening to the powers of the giants, when it was not them. What those aspects of the story are describing are the beginning of the cosmological catastrophe that will usher in the deluge. All of the scientific evidence is right in this story for the cataclysm that happened in the past. Like, what do you want from me? It's all right there. Once you get rid of you get rid of the religious garbage, and you get rid of mainstream garbage, and you just look at it objectively, scientifically, and historically, suddenly the Nephilim and their fate makes sense in a realistic way. So it begs the question, are the Nephilim real? Now, what's interesting is that we can continue on through history after this event, and what do we find? We actually find some Nephilim survivors, don't we? We see giants remaining in the historical narrative after the deluge. Because, of course, not everybody is killed. Not everybody dies. There are survivors. What's even more interesting is that Earth's gravity will be altered completely after this event. If Earth's gravity changes, what should we expect to happen to the giants? Well, if Earth's gravity got heavier, what that means is that the giants are not going to be operating at their peak capacity. So what we should expect to find is we should find histories talking about giants who still exist, but they're not able to do what they used to do. And that is exactly what we find in the histories. We have no choice but to take the story of the Nephilim seriously.